All right, today we're stepping into the forge to tell a story that was hammered out in the fires of history. It's about a man who walked that razor's edge between science and straight-up sorcery. His name still echoes in medicine, but it's also whispered by occultists. And our story, it doesn't start with the man, it starts with a parable.
Imagine this. In some forgotten village, there's an old blacksmith who does things differently. He thinks real knowledge isn't hiding in some ancient dusty book. Nope, he says you find it in the searing heat of the forge. That truth only shows itself when you have the guts to melt something down to its core and see what it's really made of.
You know, all the other smiths, they're just following the old instruction manuals, right? Doing what's always been done. But this guy, he trusted his own two eyes. He learned from the colors in the flame, the sound of steam hissing off hot metal. His forge wasn't just a workshop, it was his lab. And the thing is, this isn't just some campfire story. This parable, it's the key to understanding a very real, very revolutionary, and frankly, a deeply controversial figure from our own history.
So, who was he? Who was this real-life blacksmith who looked at the world and saw a giant crucible, who believed that to heal a person you had to get your hands dirty with the raw elements of creation itself?
His given name was Theophrastus von Hohenheim. A bit of a mouthful, right? Which is probably why the world came to know him as Paracelsus. He was the blacksmith from our story, come to life. A doctor, an alchemist, a rebel who didn't just study medicine. He wrestled its secrets out of the earth itself, with methods that absolutely terrified the establishment.
So let's get into it. Let's see how Paracelsus took that blacksmith's philosophy and used it like a sledgehammer on the brittle, dusty traditions of his day. He wasn't just proposing new theories. Oh no, he was declaring all-out war on the old ones.
And I mean that literally. In this incredible act of pure rebellion at the University of Basel, he gathered up the most respected medical books of his time, works by giants like Galen, and just tossed them into a bonfire. He actually shouted that his shoelaces knew more than these ancient masters. Can you imagine? The message was crystal clear. The time for old books was over. It was time for fire.
You see, for him, the whole world was a university. He learned his trade not in some clean lecture hall, but on bloody battlefields as an army surgeon. He collected wisdom from people the academics wouldn't even look at. Miners, barbers, midwives. And his travels took him everywhere, all the way to Russia, to Constantinople. There are even wild legends that say he was captured by Tatars and wound up traveling with the prince all the way to the Far East, picking up all sorts of mystical knowledge along the way.
And this right here is the heart of his entire revolution. Back then, medicine was all about the four humors. The idea was that being sick was just your internal fluids being out of whack. Paracelsus looked at that and basically said, that's ridiculous. He argued that sickness wasn't internal. It was an invasion, an external enemy, like a tiny poison that gets into your body and messes up its chemistry. Nobody was thinking like this. It was a game changer. So to fight these invaders, he came up with his own system, the Tria Prima. He said everything, and he meant everything, from a person to a pebble, was made of three essential principles. Now don't think of them as literal chemicals. Think of them as concepts. Sulfur was the fiery, combustible part, the soul. Mercury was the volatile, airy part, the spirit. And salt was the stable, solid part, the body. For him, chemistry was deeply spiritual. To separate these elements in a lab was to understand how to purify the human soul itself.
And that leads us to maybe his most famous idea, something we still live by today. His rivals were totally horrified because he was using things like arsenic and mercury as medicine, stuff that should kill you. But Paracelsus got it. He understood a basic truth that's now the foundation of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. He realized the very same things that could kill you could also cure you if you just used the right amount. He was basically inventing pharmacology from scratch.
Okay, so what happens when your radical chemical cures made from poisons actually start working? Well, people can't explain it with science, so they reach for something else, magic. The man was quickly turning into a myth.
It's just like our blacksmith from the beginning of the story, right? His skill was so beyond what anyone else could do that they just assumed it had to be supernatural. For Paracelsus, his medical genius was so profound that people started seeing him as a sorcerer. The guy who just wanted to heal people with chemistry was suddenly a legend who could command spirits and held the secrets of life and death.
And at the center of this growing legend was his sword. He carried this big, heavy blade everywhere, but almost never seemed to draw it. And on its pommel was a single word, Azoth. To an alchemist,
Azoth was, well, it was everything. The beginning and the end. The universal life force that runs through all of creation. It was the biggest concept in their world, captured in one word.
And the stories about this sword? They were absolutely wild. Some people swore the pommel held the Philosopher's Stone. Others whispered it contained something called the Alkahest, a universal solvent he'd supposedly been given in the East. And the darkest rumors? They claimed he had a literal demon trapped in the hilt, forced to do his bidding. That sword became the perfect symbol for the man himself, part doctor's tool, part magician's wand.
But his ambitions went so much further than just healing. I mean, he made maybe the most audacious claim in the entire history of alchemy, that he could create life, an artificial person, a homunculus, and he even wrote down the recipe. It involved a sealed jar, 40 days buried in warm horse manure, and feeding the result with drops of human blood. He claimed you'd get a perfectly formed little man, intelligent but with no soul.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Wow, this guy was playing God. And you're not wrong. But in his mind, it wasn't about arrogance. It was about discovery. He wanted to master the arcana, the hidden secrets of creation. It was like he wanted to pop the hood on the universe and see how the engine really worked. So you have this towering figure, surrounded by all these incredible legends and discoveries. But the reality of his life, well, it wasn't so glamorous. All that genius, all that rebellion, it came at a very, very high price. He lived by this idea that a doctor had to be a wanderer. But his constant traveling wasn't just some noble quest for knowledge. A lot of the time, he was running for his life. The medical establishment he'd so publicly insulted hated him. They saw his strange chemical cures as a threat, and they hounded him from one city to the next. He was a man on the run. And that's the great paradox of his life, isn't it? He was one of the most famous people of his time, but he was always an outsider, always alone and foreign. He didn't belong to any city or any university. His only real home was out in the world, and the nature that he was trying so desperately to understand. So after all that, the fire, the travel, the controversy, what's left? How are we supposed to make sense of a man like this? A man whose whole philosophy was about taking things apart and putting them back together in a new way. Well, his legacy is split right down the middle, just like his own art. On one side, you've got Paracelsus the scientist. He's the father of toxicology, the guy who brought chemistry to medicine, the ultimate rebel against blind tradition. But on the other side, you've got Paracelsus the magician, the guy with the demon sword, the alchemist who claimed he could create life and talk to spirits. And of course, a life like that could never have a simple ending. He died in Salzburg in 1541, but no one's quite sure how. Officially, it was natural causes. But there's a rumor that's never gone away, that he was murdered, pushed down a flight of stairs by thugs hired by the very doctors he'd spent his life fighting against. And that brings us right back to our parable. The blacksmith eventually packs his tools and leaves town. But the village is never the same. He taught everyone to look at the world differently, to see that power and purity could be found in the raw, dirty earth. And that's exactly what Paracelsus did for medicine and maybe for science itself. So what's the final verdict? Was he a charlatan who got lucky? A misunderstood scientific genius? Or maybe, just maybe, his story shows us that the kind of mind that truly changes the world always looks a little bit like madness from the outside. That the greatest pioneers are always the ones with one foot planted firmly in the lab and the other in a world of magic.